Okay, everybody raise your hands. Just one. Kevin. All right, if you are married, you can lower your hand. If you intend to be married, you can lower your hand. This is for you, Ben. Everything is for you today. If you are in a relationship, you can lower your hand of any sort. That means a mutual relationship with somebody, even a Christian brother or sister. Ben, lower your hand already. Are you going to keep your hand up too? This is all for you then today. No. The point that I want to make, okay, we're going to talk about relationships this morning a little bit. Paul encouraged me to do something about mental health, and I kind of wanted to take that and move that in a direction. One of the things that we talk about with mental health, especially as we're entering into this last period of this first year for some of you, graduation year for some others of you, right? Or third year for some of us as well. But we have this whole idea of what is the best remedy for our mental health. Well, it's really the best remedy for our spiritual health, for our emotional health as well, and that is to be involved in relationships. And the whole thing about relationships is we want them to be the best relationships that we can possibly have, right? This is a yes, right? Amen. We want them to be the best relationships that we can possibly have. Well, we want to talk about this from maybe a marriage standpoint, but understand when you hear me mention marriage this morning, this is going to apply to all of relationships as well. So let's go ahead and turn to Ephesians, actually. Some of you already know where I'm going. Ephesians chapter 4. Just joking, it's 5. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. Wives, submit to your husbands as you are to the Lord. You're dismissed. Nothing could ever be clearer, right? Everything is fine. Everything's dandy with that. No, we have a problem with that in modern day America, right? We don't want to hear that verse, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, because of the way that we view our own equality with each other, especially in the marital relationship. And I think for good reason, right? Listen, if you are to go back to the original texts of this, as you look at the earliest texts, Paul is sending this around, or we have Paul that's writing this, and it's being sent around to other people. It's going to read like this: wives, to your husbands as to the Lord's. There's not going to be a verb in there, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but why isn't there a verb in there? Well, if you were to go about looking at the Greek of this, we take our verb oftentimes from the previous statement that's going on to this. So, but first of all, when they heard this back in the first century, this was not a huh statement, it was a duh statement. Because there's this idea of patrias potestas, right? This idea with the Romans and the Greeks, and somewhat even with the Jews. Hey, this is coming off my ears. That wives are the property of their husbands. This is an idea that was not radical to them. It's radical to us because of how we view our equality. And we know that it's not like that all over the world. But I mean, you look back in Jesus, it's really the one that really establishes this idea. But look at that verse before it, because it's taking its verb from the verse before it. Be subject or be submissive, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And this is the whole idea, Paul wants to make this statement, be submissive to one another out of reverence for Christ. And yes, this has everything to do with our marriage relationship, but think about this, how much this has to do with your relationship with other people, right? Think about how we come into relationships, especially the marriage relationship. We come into that relationship with, if you could imagine with me, a box. And inside of this box, I have all of my hopes and my dreams and my desires, my expectations is then what it becomes to look like as I hand those over. I'm coming up to my nuptials, and I have all of these hopes and my dreams and my expectations, my desires. I'm sorry, let's leave that word out for a second. My hopes, my dreams and desires. You know, what I think that life should look like. And why shouldn't it look like the life that I want it to look like? Because it's what I've been establishing in my mind and my heart from the very beginning. And I come up with that box, and I hand it over to my sweet wife, and she has her own box, and she's handing it over to me. But what it looks like to me that she's handing over to me, and what it looks like to her that I'm handing over to her, is a box of expectations. These are the things that I think should happen in my relationship with you. I think that it should look like this, and you think that it should look like this, and then there becomes a problem, right? Because it looks like something, and I have this expectation that you're going to fulfill all of my hopes and my dreams and my desires. And all you're feeling is the weight of that box. And the weight of that box then becomes this idea of a debtor relationship. If I expect you to pay me back for something that I think that you owe me, it's kind of hard to show love in that relationship, isn't it? Think about it. If I owe you $100, Ed, and I pay you 50 of those 100, it's hard to think in terms of, wow, that was a great gift. Thank you for honoring me with that gift, David, because the thought then is what? Where's the other 50? Right? It becomes very, very difficult. That's why he says this needs to be something that is mutual. But catch this. Paul is not just taking and making up a brand new idea. He's not breaking up a brand new commandment. This is going all the way back. And in fact, you look at all of Paul's imperatives in his letters, even all of the imperatives in all of the letters of the New Testament. And you see that they're taking their cue from what Jesus has said, and they all happen to deal around these things. And that verse that Michael read to us out of John chapter 13. Imagine this scenario, right? Jesus is there in the upper room with his disciples. We know a lot of the things that have built up to this. And we don't know this from John chapter 13, but we know it from the rest of the Gospels as we kind of build this picture. The disciples, and I like to imagine it like this, that this has kind of happened before this. The disciples are arguing about who's best amongst them. We get to this section in John, and I think it's at this point that Jesus stands up and he wraps that towel around his waist. And he gets down on his hands and knees, and he washes their feet. And it's been an odd night. You know, Judas has gone out, and he's decided to betray Jesus. He's washing their feet. And it's after this foot washing that Jesus stands up and he says, "This, a new commandment I give to you." At which point, any good Jewish person should have just walked out of the room. Right? A new commandment, you can expound on the commandments that God has told us. You can exegete them. But a new commandment, nobody gives new commandments. But they understand something different about Jesus. Right? A new commandment I give to you. And he starts out, love one another. And they say, that's not new, Jesus. And he says, yep, but I'm not through with it either. Love one another as what? I have loved you. So you should also love one another. And they're thinking maybe this is in terms of him washing our feet. And I think it was. I think it really was for them at that point. That we should get down and we should serve people on a level and love them by serving them. But I wonder if it goes further than that. You know, it's coming up to Matthew and Peter and saying, hey, Peter, you remember when I called Matthew? And he says, yeah, I remember that. Matthew, do you remember it? Yeah. Did I hold it against you that you were a tax collector? He says, no. You remember what happened after that? Yeah, we went to my house. Peter, do you remember? Yeah, it was the worst day of my life. He invited all of his tax collector friends, and we ate there with him. Nathaniel, do you remember this? That when I called you, you dissed my entire family, my grandparents, all of my stickball team, right? Everybody that was in my world at that time, you dissed them. Did I ever hold it against you? No. He says, here's what I want you to do. Peter, Matthew, Nathaniel, I want you to go and live your lives just as that same way that I loved you, but to everyone else for the rest of your life. So what's this whole box of expectations and on our side, hopes and dreams and desires come into play? How does that work with this? Well, if you flip back over to that idea in Ephesians that we were just in, this idea of submit yourselves one unto another, the idea is this. Remember what it said after that? As to the Lord. This idea, as to the Lord. Paul is going to come up with that over and over and over again as he gives these imperatives for people to follow. Submit to each other as to the Lord. In other words, And catch this. Our relationships with other people are not just about you submitting to me. It's about me learning to submit to you and me learning to live out of your hopes and your dreams and your desires rather than just me hoping that you're going to complete mine. And that's a hard idea because we think, well, let me put it this way, none of us think that yours are better than mine. We come into relationships thinking in terms of, why aren't you doing things the way that I want you to do them? To which Paul is saying, you're missing the point there. What did Christ do for you? In fact, if you want to read back over there, he's going to continue on with this statement. Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, the body of which he is the Savior. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands. That didn't shake them up. This next part did. Catch this. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. What do you mean? What do you mean, Paul? I've got to love my wife. She's my property. She's my woman. She's the one that is supposed to be following me and doing what I tell her to. It didn't shake them up to say, wives, submit to your husbands. What shook them up in this was this idea of husbands, love your wives. And it's stating what Jesus said all throughout the Gospels, that there is an equality between man and woman, that God has prized from the very beginning. I'm showing it to you now. We have a problem with it in this day and age because we hold that equality to be something that we at least desire. They didn't have a problem with that submissiveness that wives are supposed to give to their husbands. What they probably would have had a problem with more than that is, husbands, what my responsibility is to my wife. To love her just as what? Christ loved the church. You see that imperative again there? How do we love them? How do we submit to him? It's how Christ did it for you. And Christ did it for me. And yeah, it was about washing their feet and being subject to everyone and humbling yourself in front of everyone so that you would lift them up and consider them better than yourselves. But to this audience, they knew the end of that story because it wasn't just that he did for them, right? Because it was just hours later that he's going to go to the cross for all of them. And Paul's saying, do it like that. That's what Jesus was saying in that statement, a new commandment I give to you. Because that idea wasn't through. A new commandment I give to you is that you love one another as I have loved you. Listen, I'm going to tell you this right now, and you can either trust me or trust the word as this is going forward here. But this is the idea. If you want a positive relationship, especially with your spouse, but with anybody that you have contact with, anybody, I'm talking about brother to brother, sister to sister, brother to sister, if I'm engaged to somebody right now, or if I'm married to them, right? I'm talking about any relationship. You want to have a positive relationship with them. You want to give them and you the best shot at having a relationship that continues forward, that can serve you and serve Christ to the best of the ability of that relationship. It's this. I got to learn to live out of the hopes and the dreams and the desires of that person's box. And consider them more important than I consider myself. We've heard of the golden rule, right? Golden rule is do unto others as you have done unto you. Jesus says, okay, there's 600 and something laws that you all know, and God reduced it. Well, I mean, he expounded on those 10 that he gave us in the very first place. I'm going to reduce it down to 2, right? We know those 2. Love God, love each other. He says, I'm going to reduce it down even more to 1. How do you love God? To the best of your ability. It is to love them as I have loved you. So you also should love one another. Isn't that amazing? I think it's just incredible that he takes everything and he boils it down. If you couldn't get the 10, if you couldn't get the 600 and some that were there before, let me give you 2. Okay, you can't get those 2? Well, here's the real basic essence of this. To do the best that you can, to love the other person, and to have the relationship, the only commandment that I'm commanding of you that you really just need to listen to is that you consider others better than yourself. That would be the platinum rule. To love God is to love others as Jesus loved them. But how do you do this? You can't get rid of your hopes and your dreams and your desires. You can't just cast them out. You can't just forget that you have them, right? Because we all have them. That's our core level. That's who we are on the deepest part of ourselves. That's who we are when we share ourselves with other people. It's our hopes and our dreams, our desires. I would add to that our fears sometimes. What do you do with that? Well, I think Peter answers that. You want to turn over to 1 Peter chapter 5. And we'll end here this morning. Starting in verse 5, actually pick up in the second part of verse 5. He says, "And all of you must clothe yourselves with humility in your dealings with one another." In other words, if there's a line that is forming of who's going to be first and who's going to get their stuff done, you're going to go to the back of the line. Why? Because he says God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. It's not like the mighty hand of God. It's like God's hand is our canopy in this, or it's holding us in this sense. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that, at the right time, so that he may exalt you in due time. In his timing, he may exalt you. This is where this becomes really important to all of us, because we understand that we can't just get rid of ourselves as we're serving, as we're loving, as we're dealing in relationship with another person. It becomes important to us in this next part. Check this out. Cast all of your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. In other words, it's going to hurt. All of this stuff, when I learn to live out of your box, when my spouse learns to live out of my box, when you are trying to live out of your spouse's box or whatever relationship you're in, it's going to be like, okay, but I thought that life should have looked like this. And that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard work. And Peter says this, your anxieties that come from that, what do you do with those? You cast them on the Lord. You trust him that he's the one that can take care of these things, and that he's the one that will lift you up in due time as you're living humbly in his presence. Listen, guys and gals, relationships are so important, and you can't not have them. That's just the reality. You can't not have a relationship with somebody. The question is going to be, are you going to have a good relationship, or are you going to have a bad relationship, or where on that spectrum it's going to lie? Paul and Jesus and Peter, I think, would all agree on this. That you submit yourselves one unto another as Christ did for you. To what length does that go? Washing each other's feet, yes, and whatever the equivalent of that is in your life and your relationship. But also to the nth degree, just as Christ did for the church and gave himself up for the church. I encourage you to read through more of Ephesians 5 with that light of, this is an exposition on what Jesus has said from the very beginning later on today. And not just view that as a marriage chapter, because he makes a very interesting and apt statement at the very end about this being a mystery and about this being about the church. about how we deal with one another. I hope that as we go into this research week, that each and every one of us has just a great and restful time, a time to renew, a time to recharge. But remember, at the end of the day, you're going to have relationships with people. And the question then becomes, how are you going to make those better and glorifying ultimately to God? God bless you all.